think maybe I'll give a little background about this. This is a 3-year project that Mary and I were had a grad student. I think maybe we had a couple of different grad students on this. We actually started this thing in the middle of actually planted it the fall before COVID happened in the spring of 2020. So we had a lot of things that we were trying to dodge there initially. Most importantly, trying to figure out what in the world we were doing with this and how best to efficiently do this project. But then we were also having to manage around a lot of those social distancing type of policies that were in place at the time. So we had oftentimes anywhere from about 6 people on this project, and they were 10 feet apart. So it took a large area to accomplish this. But as Mary said, we did wanted to look at some of the winter hardy small grains, more in a silage production system. This one was conducted on East Campus in Lincoln. That's where all of our equipment was. That's where all of our supplies were. More importantly, that's where all the students and the help were that were needed to accomplish this. So this was actually a pretty fun project, and I'll give you a little bit of a highlight about some of our findings today. I always have trouble with that. So what we'll talk about a little bit, we'll kind of finish up with our quality silage review that we started on Tuesday. Talk a little bit about some of the growth stages of these small grains. Look a little bit again at silage dry matter because silage dry matter was important on Tuesday and it's important today as well. One of the things we'll look at is a little bit of the fermentation profile from this study, which is that's going to be a lot of the information you don't normally get on a traditional forage nutritive value report. And then we'll look at the forage dry matter yield and the nutritive value of what we had harvested and made silage out of. So when we talk about quality silage, this figure that's on the left-hand side, you guys that seen that on Tuesday, and we were working with the sorghum, so we were talking about silage and hay for those. Today, we're going to be focused more on the different types of silage, and importantly, we're looking right here around this 60 to 65 percent moisture at storage. Again, the reason we're doing that, there's a couple there. The first one is that we're looking at the reduction in storage losses. The second is that's kind of where some of our preconceived notions of where our carbohydrates are needed. So, kind of to summarize the silage requirements, effectively, you've got to have adequate moisture, not too much, not too little. You've got to have a source of available carbohydrates for fermentation. And then the important thing is to get all the oxygen excluded from that. Looking at this panel on the right, this is a figure that shows all the fermentable carbohydrates provided by corn, grass, and alfalfa. Buried here in the middle is grass, which we were working with. Oftentimes, you don't see much more about 20% soluble carbohydrates as a percent of the dry matter for grass. If I recall, Mary, we were down here, the ones we looked at, we were often around that 10%. So if you look at the 10% fermentable carbohydrates, follow that over, that puts you down to the forage moisture of 65. So grass silage is probably, I wouldn't call it best, but it's certainly recommended to put that up somewhere at the moisture of 60 to 65%. The growth stages that we were looking at, we had a boot stage, which was mid to late May. I think Mary had asked me a question about she's got some cereal rye this year going into boot or starting to boot already. So it can be early May, but at least during the course of our study, boot stage was mid to late May. We also looked at pollination or anthesis, that point that the anthers that emerge. We were actually looking for stages that we could readily identify. Our goal was to try to hit 50% of those stages at our harvest. We did okay. The more practice we had in the later maturity that these plants got. And then our last harvest was the pollination was early June. So mid to late May to early June, you've got about a 2 to 3 week period there. So that happens pretty quickly. In wheat, it happens awfully quickly. I think it was pretty consistent that was about 3 to 4 days. Rye and triticale were 7 to 10 to 14. That soft dough stage was the last stage we were looking at, and that was mid to late June. So during the course of silage harvest of small grains, you're probably looking at a window somewhere from mid to late May to mid to late June. So there is some time there that if something happens, you're not gonna lose a lot by being put off a day or two, or possibly even a week. Silage dry matter. Mary and I have always had this discussion. This is the thing that's most important. This is the hardest thing to try to measure when you're harvesting and packing silage. We had a Coster tester out with us, and we still didn't do a very good job with that, particularly in the early in the boot stage. And so a couple of high points on this. It's if you just look at the patterns there, if you look at the percent dry matter in boot stage or percent moisture, that's over 85 or 16, 17% dry matter, 85, 86% moisture. So it's extremely wet in the boot stage. As you move through the progression of plant maturity through anthesis and milk and soft dough, you can see a nice trend there, moving from around 17% dry matter in boot stage up to about 20 for anthesis, about 30 for the milk stage, and then about 40 for soft dough. I'd like to point out that 40 for soft dough is also going to be that 60% moisture, which is where we would recommend harvesting that. So what we did in this study, we had to field wilt the boot, the anthesis, and the milk stage. The soft dough stage was more or less direct harvested. We did not field wilt it.
Yeah, so I would point out that based off of samples from producers' operations, Darren made the comment, it's really hard to estimate, even with the Coster tester. It is very easy to overestimate how dry it is. And one of the things that is consistently seen is that when we get it wrong, right? So if we're down here in this 25, for instance, you lose a lot more energy during that fermentation process because you're not getting the right kind of fermentation. You're getting more clostridial fermentation. And that was something we also saw in a lot of operations. So one thing to take away, make sure that you're making it dry enough before you start packing it.
Yep, thanks, Barry. That's a very good lead into this next set of slides here. And I toyed with these. I put these in, and I took them out, and I put them back in, and I thought about it and decided to leave it in. I think it's kind of this is the things that you don't see that are going on, but there are reasons that explain why things happen. Again, this panel on the left. Again, this is nothing with data. This is just the patterns that occur. That kind of talks a little bit about the fermentation phases, and there are 5 of them. That first one is the aerobic phase, and that lasts about a day. The second one is the lag phase. It lasts about a day. So you move through the first 2 stages very quickly. What's going on in that stage number 1 of that aerobic phase is that's where the oxygen is being eliminated from the forage within the silage. pH hasn't started to drop yet. Those silage bacteria, the ones that we would like, the lactic acid bacteria, haven't yet begun to grow. It's during this lag phase where we see those the bacteria begin to increase in number. Oxygen is dropped off, hopefully to from whatever level it was down to 0. Populations of lactic acid bacteria begin to increase. And as they increase, that silage pH begins to drop. There's a point about halfway through the fermentation phase that the lactic acid bacteria, they begin to drop off in number. That's because of that decrease in silage pH. Also, that decrease in silage pH is what keeps the nasty ones away, the ones that produce all the things that we don't want that we'll look at in the next slide. So basically, beginning about day 14, if you've done a good job with the moisture management and you've got the carbohydrates there and the oxygen has been removed very quickly, that starts to stabilize very quickly. Under good conditions, about day 21, you kind of reached about the extent of what's going to happen. We let our little mini silos. We did this in 5-gallon buckets. We let those ferment for 45 days. Once it stabilizes, that is the stable phase. Then you've got the feed out phase, which that's going to be a whole different set of management issues that you have to work around. On the right-hand panel, there's the top panel is good silage, which would describe what we just had talked about previously. On that bottom panel is poor silage. Looking at the good silage, actually, if you're making good silage, there's not a whole lot going on. Okay, pH is dropping, lactic acid bacteria are increasing and then stabilizing, and acetic acid bacteria are lower in number. Okay, if you look at poor silage, you got the lines on that get all wonky, if you will. You can see an initial drop in pH, but it also starts to go up at the end. And then you look at the butyric acid, the lactic acid, and the acetic acid. Two acids that you want in silage are lactic and acetic, and you want more lactic than you do acetic. Ideally, you would have zero butyric. What that butyric acid does is that pH increases. I mentioned earlier about the pH is what controls the bacteria in the silage. So as that pH starts to increase because you didn't get it dropped down low enough to basically I'll call it kill those other types of bacteria, they'll kind of take over and begin producing. One of the things that the butyric acid uses for energy are those lactic acids. So any lactic acid that you produce gets used up by the butyric acid producing bacteria. That's why you see that lactic acid line, which is the long dash line, kind of increase and then drop back down to zero. Okay. And so effectively, if you look at pH, it ends up about what it was when you started. So it doesn't look like anything happened. But I can assure you, when you open the silo, you'll know that something happened. Again, Mary, our one of the things we wanted to do, we wanted to try to make bad silage. It took us one bucket to make bad silage. And what we did, it was that first harvest where that moisture was over 85%, and we packed it right away in that 5-gallon bucket. And it was not good. So the post fermentation profile, if you will, you see typical values there in that column. That's the second one in there. I've highlighted lactic acid is green, butyric is red, and acetic acid is yellow, kind of a red, yellow, green kind of thing there. So that lactic is what we wanted, or what you want. Typical values of lactic acid as a percent of dry matter are somewhere between 6 to 10. We were within that range only during the boot stage. We were lower than that at later maturities. However, that silage was still was pretty good silage. Part of that reason is because of that butyric acid and lactic acid all fell within the range of typical values that we see, with the exception of that one high value on butyric acid at pollination. They were all well below. About two of them were well below, around 0.1, so they were extremely low. Dry matter forage yield, this is the stuff that you get to see. If you look at yield as it increases over the stage of maturities, that's really nothing there that's we don't already know. These yields are going to be higher probably than you'll see in a field situation. As I said, these were, I would call them small plots, but they were 10 feet wide by 100 feet long. That's how much it took us to produce this. So they were plots, but they were extremely large experimental plots. Yields early on, especially in the boot stage, within a species, they were not any different. We did tend to see both triticale and wheat numerically a little higher. Wheat remained pretty consistent in yield on through anthesis. Again, that was only about a 3 to 4 day period, so it wasn't really interested in adding dry matter yield. It was trying to get its grain production cranked up. Those all remained pretty close there through the. I think we had a difference there at anthesis, but it was pretty minor. You get to the end of the season, that's really where they started to separate there. Both triticale, the blue line, and the rye, the dotted line, were both greater than wheat, but they were not different from each other, even though there's a little separation. Some of what happened there in that decrease in the wheat yield between milk and soft dough is that grain started to mature. That wheat plant started to senesce, and we had quite a bit of leaf loss on that, waiting to get to the soft dough stage. So that was part of the reasons why we'd seen that yield reduction. So summarize this at basically prior to soft dough, we didn't really see any appreciable differences in forage yield. Soft dough, as we said, both the rye and the triticale had greater yield than the wheat. Looking at the silage nutritive value, and here I pulled out of Abigail's thesis the digestible organic matter and crude protein. Again, looking at the digestible organic matter on the left hand side, again you can see it decrease over the course of the season. Triticale was oftentimes, if it was a low one, it was the lowest one. There was not any difference at boot milk for anything, but at anthesis, triticale was lower than wheat and rye. And if I recall on that, I believe triticale was also greater than the wheat. Looking toward the end at the soft dough, the winter wheat and the cereal rye were similar, and triticale was lower than that. Recall that triticale had some high yields though, so if you looked at making a calculation on digestible organic matter yield, triticale kind of replaced, wouldn't be at the bottom of the list on digestible organic matter yield. Looking at crude protein, I didn't put those circles on there because I would have had circles at every maturity date. But again, one of the things that you see is that all across all three of those species, crude protein decreased over their production window. Cereal rye, interestingly, was about 1 to 2 percentage units higher across the board, particularly for the boot anthesis and the milk stage. Again, once you get down to the soft dough stage, I believe that crude protein of that triticale was lower than either the cereal rye or the winter wheat. So, you do pick up some differences, but when we're talking about protein decreasing over a month and a half from probably 18 down to around 14, while that's a decrease, that's not, I wouldn't call that anything to get too excited about. So in summary, the highest quality silage is from forage that's harvested in the boot stage. Okay, that's no surprise. I'd like to point out that whether we're returning kind of to the sorghum from Tuesday, whether we're harvesting it as hay as silage, or whether you're using sorghums, or whether you're using small grains, it's not going to get any better after you harvest it than it is when you harvest it. Putting it in the silo and insiding it's not going to improve the quality of it. Putting it in a hay bale is not going to improve the quality of it. Effectively, even though we did pick up some small differences, there really wasn't anything major relative to harvest timing or those plant maturities between the species. For high quality forage, at least in our study, harvesting at pollination has a pretty good balance of yield without sacrificing a great lot of overall nutritive value. Cereal rye, as we mentioned, generally has 1 to 2% greater crude protein than the other two that we looked at. Then I had alluded to this for maximum energy or TDN yield. Harvesting at soft dough is a little better option than picking one of the other stages. So really can't go wrong unless you wait too late. So again, the take home messages: no major differences in forage yield except at the later stages of maturity. This one is important: is wilting is needed if harvested prior to soft dough. But all three of these grains can be used to make pretty high quality silage. And so that we've got some time for discussion and other questions.
Yeah, so Darren, one of the questions that Carol asked was what the planting population was.
Yeah, so the planting population on that, we planted about 90 pounds of seed an acre for these. I'll admit that was probably, looking back now, that was probably too high a seeding rate. I would probably back off some of that now, but this was planted very high. We did fertilize it in the spring with 60 pounds of nitrogen.
Would packing in a bunker silo be difficult?
Without knowing the real answer to that, I think the answer to that question is yes, but it really depends. Mary,
Yeah.
you probably have more experience with that, some of that work you guys have done.
Yeah, so as I was alluding to before, we've done some survey work with producers who are making small grain silage. And one of the things that has consistently came up was that they had a hard time getting the packing density where you want it. And the key to packing density, right, is that that excludes oxygen, which helps that go through that early phase quicker, which preserves more of the energy and quality. So it is difficult for a couple different reasons. But one of them, I would say, is just that we tend to have this challenge where now we have custom harvesters. They come and they harvest, and in that process, they have a lot of incoming forage in a very short amount of time. And that means that you don't have as much time to pack in between layers. So a couple key things, regardless of whether it's small grains or not, you want to make sure that you are doing small layers, like 4 inches would be ideal. Not putting on more than that at a time, and then making sure you are taking the time to pack. The other one, which I thought was going to be more of a challenge, was if it was drier, they would have a harder time getting it packed than if it was wetter. But the truth is, we really don't see much difference. I mean, if you get it really dry, yes, but if you're within your window, it's not that big of a deal one way or the other. So small layers, really, really important, and not getting in too big of a hurry. But yes, it is difficult to pack. That's why if you have the opportunity or the option, bagging small grain silage sure looks awfully nice. I realize there's some extra cost to that, but you do get a little better preservation. Carol asked, is there any research on forage oats for silage?
Carol, we have not done any. If there is, it's probably going to be up, excuse me, up in Wisconsin or Minnesota. Jerry, are you aware of any oat silage?
No, no, I'm not. Typically with oats, most people I know or work with, it's for hay or grazing.
I mean, along that line, though, Carol, yeah, there would be no reason why oat couldn't be used as a silage either. I'll say the timing, it'd be the agronomic timing. That'd be probably a spring planted oat, harvested sometime in the early to mid part of June, probably. Does that
Yeah.
seem reasonable, Jerry?
Yes, yeah.
And
It'd be mid-June, mid-late June.
I've seen some people make oats into silage, and looking at the nutritive value relative to the stage at harvest, I don't really see huge differences between that and the winter hardy. Like if you look at it relative boot or relative milk,
Yeah.
fairly similar, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah,
think
and what Mary's talking about there, we didn't. Not all three of those species were at boot stage on the same day. They weren't all on pollination on the same day, so we were more or less doing something out there every day on those different stages. So when she talks about within the stage, the boot for cereal rye would, might be happening today, boot for wheat's not going to be for another 10 days or 2 weeks probably. But
We-
when you compare the quality and the yield at those stages, they're pretty similar.
Which is important to recognize, because if you look at things at the same date, the story may not be the same, if that makes sense. So we were doing it at the same relative stage, and like oats would be very different in terms of the timing as the winter hardy, because it's going to be behind, of course. But that is probably why some people have observations and think, for instance, cereal rye is lower quality. Well, yes, at the same relative age, it might be. But at the same relative stage, it isn't. So hitting the right maturity for what your target is important. And frankly, as Darren kind of said, 2-3 days, it switches maturity. So it's like, you look at it, you think, oh, I'm getting close. And then by the time you're ready to go, you're already a stage ahead.